The modern vacuum cleaner is a wonderful contraption. It's really quite magical the way it makes dirt vanish from completely inaccessible places. And before it was invented, houses were just much, much dirtier places, more like my workshop. Though even my workshop isn't usually quite as dirty as this. It may be a myth that vacuum cleaners are labour-saving devices. It's said that people spend just as long cleaning their houses today as they did 100 years ago. But these machines certainly have made houses cleaner. Well, in this programme, I hope to look at exactly how vacuum cleaners work and how they evolved. Without vacuum cleaners, the only way to clean carpets and upholstery was to take them outside and beat them. An activity that was traditionally performed just once a year, the spring clean. There was considerable incentive to invent a cleaning machine, particularly because Victorian houses were so cluttered and full of soft furnishings. Numerous patents for sweeping and beating machines were taken out from the 1850s onwards, and some of these did include primitive suction devices. But the practical vacuum cleaner had to wait for the arrival of reasonably small and efficient power sources. By 1900, the first internal combustion engines had appeared, and amongst other things, they were used to power compressors to generate compressed air. Several Edwardians experimented cleaning carpets and upholstery with compressed air, but the problem was that the dust just went everywhere. And then settled back down exactly where it had come from. A demonstration of this rather inadequate cleaning system on cleaning railway carriages in St Pancras Station in 1901 was witnessed by an engineer called Herbert Cecil Booth. Booth was a civil engineer who designed bridges and the enormous big wheels popular at the turn of the century. This one was put up in Blackpool in 1896. It seemed obvious to Booth that sucking the dirt into a container through a filter would be a more sensible idea. And his very first experiment, holding a hanky over a sofa and sucking hard through it, left the hanky filthy and proved the principle to himself. His first machine was simply a cloth bag to collect the dirt and a suction pump. It worked well, but it was very large, so it had to be parked outside customers' houses. It became known as the Noisy Serpent, and he was frequently sued for frightening passing horses. The success of Booth's machine was largely due to the coronation of Edward VII in 1902. In all the preparations, it hadn't been noticed until the last minute that the carpets under the throne in Westminster Abbey were filthy. Booth's machine was the only effective way of cleaning the carpet without removing it. The king later heard of this and ordered a demonstration at Buckingham Palace, buying 2 machines.
Your apparatus is frightfully impressive.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Oh.
Booth added clear inspection tubes so people could watch the dirt being sucked in, and the machines became prime attractions at fashionable soirees. With royal patronage, the success of the machine was assured.
A most marvellous modern invention.
Booth's machine caught the public imagination, but was much too large and cumbersome for most homes. So various other manufacturers started introducing much smaller, hand-powered machines. This one's the Sweeper-Vac, made in San Francisco. The British Queen. Doesn't seem to be doing very much, this one. A bit difficult to use, too. The Star. This one feels more comfortable. Just swept up a feather. And This is one called the Reeves Pneumatic Broom. Doesn't sweep very much up at a time. Nearly got that bit of dirt. No. This is the Daisy number 2. Nice action, nice crank and bellows, but I don't actually think it's getting anything off the carpet. And this one is the Baby Daisy. Oh, it's much bigger than the Daisy number 2. Slightly difficult coordinating with both the actions at once. Doesn't seem to be doing too well either. Meanwhile, in America, a caretaker called Spangler had patented a portable vacuum cleaner powered by an electric motor. He sold the patent to a harness maker called Hoover, who was worried that his trade was falling as more people changed from riding horses to driving cars. Hoover was very successful and started producing machines in other countries, including Britain.
In the carpet, excavating through the pile, work the pit gang, call the grit gang, digging deeper all the while. Oh my carpet, oh my carpet, oh my carpet, don't forget, with a Hoover, yes a Hoover, we will beat the blighters yet. Oh my carpet, oh my carpet, oh my carpet, don't forget, with a Hoover, yes a Hoover, we will beat the blighters yet.
The basic modern Hoover has really changed very little. We've cut part of this one away so you can see what's inside. This is the fan that does the sucking, and it makes the brushes and beater bars go round as well. The dirt is dislodged by the rotating brushes, sucked straight through the fan and into the dust bag at the back. The cylinder type of vacuum cleaner is slightly different. It's actually more like Booth's original machine. I'll take the bottom off this one. In this sort, the dust comes straight into the dust bag, and the air passes straight through the paper that acts as a filter and goes through the fan and finally out the grill on the top of the machine. So the positions of the fan and the dust bag are reversed. And because it's only clean air that's passing through the fan, the shape of the vanes can be much more intricate. So this sort usually has a much stronger sort of sucking power. And the bin type and the more modern flattened cylinder type are just the same as this, though the layout leaves slightly more room for bigger dust bags. The upright vacuum cleaner with the rigid dust box is a sort of hybrid. We've cut one in half so you can see what's inside. It has rotating brushes just like a Hoover, but inside the air and the dirt come straight up the back and into the dust bag, so its layout in some ways is more like the cylinder vacuum cleaner, because it's only clean air that comes out the bottom of the dust bag and goes through the enclosed fan and then finally comes out the back of the machine. Well, there are advantages and disadvantages of all these different types of vacuum cleaner, and a recent Which survey found that in overall performance there's really very little to choose between them all. By the 1920s, many companies were producing electric vacuum cleaners. Booth himself had started making them under the trade name Goblin. One of his employees was a man called Bill Sutton.
I joined Goblin in 1929, although I had a relative with the company many years before, so I knew quite a bit about the vacuum cleaner business as a youngster. This model was produced in 1908 and appeared at the first Idaho Home Exhibition. Would you like to do a bit of cleaning if I operate it?
Oh, I see, it's a two-person machine.
Yes, oh yes. Yeah. If I turn this handle, you do the cleaning.
Well, it's getting something up.
In fact, they used to, at the exhibition, have to go back to the factory and make another one if it sold one.
Although better than most hand-powered vacuum cleaners, it was still rather inconvenient, so Booth started developing his own electric models.
As you'll see, it's got the old dolly switch and some very old-fashioned flex. They wouldn't pass it with the approvals board today.
Where does the dust go?
Well, it actually goes in here.
Oh, I see, yes.
And you undo this to get at the dirt to empty the machine. This machine was first produced in 1930. Rather a unique machine in that it gives you the upright situation for easy cleaning. It's sold for £5.19 and sixpence at that time. But the interesting thing is that for dusting, all you need to do is undo the dust bag from this position here and put your arm through the dust bag and do your dusting. It did have some other tools for it, for dusting, but of course that's another story. This particular model, the Goblin Ace, is 210 volts, whereas today the standard voltage is 240. In the 30s, Bristol, there were 2 voltages. In London, they went down as far as 100 volts in certain cases.
And were there electricity shops where you could sell these things?
Oh no, the electrical shops weren't in existence then. There were only a cycle shop who did the odd electrical product. The industry had to employ vast numbers of direct selling people. In fact, Goblin had 2,500 at peak of people knocking doors.
You've heard of the radio? You have now got electricity, but this is what you haven't got, the vacuum cleaner. Look, it is...
Well, I don't know.
Yes, now, I'll just take this wire, plug it into your sockets like that, and we will have a demonstration. If you would care to stand up a minute, madam. See, now then, did you know that in that chair is hidden dirt? Every part of your house has got hidden dirt. Look, it's all in there now, madam. Look, this is what you were sitting on.
Dust! Oh.
The first thing a stuntman learns, belief is everything.
I've never been afraid of heights, ever. I guess I have a pretty healthy fear of death.
You conquer fear through knowledge. 1 centimeter this way or that way, and it's 400 miles down. I've got to know this car is going to deliver.
Control!
I'm a control freak!
When I ask it to do something, it responds. They think my stunts are crazy.
You're not taking the light bulbs.
Listen, every bit helps. I'll soon be organising a telethon to cover our monthly bills.
Well, console yourself with the money we'll save with that Abbey National, what's it, home movers deal.
I should think so, too. With the amount of money they've had out of me over the years, you could buy enough of these to give Blackpool Town an inferiority complex.
Skinflint.
OK, Gov, we're ready to go.
Now, you will give the removal men a tip.
Yes. Never put a light bulb in your back pocket.
Abbey National, the habit of a lifetime.
Created by Laboratoire Garnier, Paris. Ombre Solaire High Protection Range. Hypoallergenic. Protection against UVB protects against sunburning. Protection against UVA protects against sun aging. It's water resistant and it actively moisturizes your skin. Ombre Solaire High Protection Range. Because you love the sun and value your skin. Formulated and controlled by Laboratoire Garnier, Paris.
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
New Arm & Hammer Baking Soda Toothpaste natural cleaning power gives your whole mouth a terrific fresh from the dentist feeling of clean. Try it.
It must be the baking soda. Wow.
It must be new Arm & Hammer Baking Soda Toothpaste.
Swinton Price Promise. Contact your local branch for a quote.
Destination Discovery, the new Discovery Channel Europe monthly magazine featuring detailed listings of program information across each month. With original editorial and your at-a-glance guide through the myriad of Discovery programs, adding to your enjoyment of the Discovery Channel. Find your favorite Discovery programs in this accessible format. Available by subscription for just £15 per year. Destination Discovery Magazine. For further information, telephone this hotline 0645 650 750.
I'm now going to look at the various parts of the vacuum cleaner in greater detail. First, the motor. Electric motors are rather baffling devices, but they all depend basically on the ability of electricity to magnetize things. If I wrap a bit of wire round a nail, oops, oh dear, got it tangled up. The more turns, the stronger the magnetism. I'm going to use 12 volts DC from a car battery, and of course you must never ever use mains for something like this. The nail becomes magnetic when I complete the circuit, and when I break it again, most of the magnetism is lost. And if I wrap the wire around a little copper tube and hold it above the nail, then the magnetic attraction will pull the nail off the table. Let's get it slightly more. This is an industrial electromagnet. The coil of wires in here, and this is the lump of metal it pulls in. This one's actually out of a fruit machine. It's the device that pushes the coins out when you win. Well, I use these devices a lot on the machines that I make. I made this for a local solicitor. It's a portrait of the founder of the firm, his great-uncle. And he wanted to be able to control it so it would react to his clients' sometimes dubious confidences. In the end, he got cold feet and placed the control box so that the clients themselves could use it. Well, if you look at the back, you can see that the device that makes the wig go up in the air is one of these electromagnets. And by themselves, these electromagnets can only produce this rather jerky linear action, but it's actually not too difficult to use the electromagnetic attraction to make something rotate.
To show the principles of a simple electric motor, I've made a motor out of virtual rubbish. Nails, hacksaw blade, an old needle, a cork, and a dog food can. The commutator is the part in the vacuum cleaner motor I've made from a cork with wires running up there.
It acts as a sort of rotating switch. Each wire is attached to a coil. When the wires are in contact with the brass strips, current passes through. So at any time, only one pair of coils are energized.
These pair of coils here are magnetized by the electric current, and they're attracted to this pair of coils. Now, when it pulls to there, these coils switch off, and it brings on the next pair of coils, which are attracted to there. Of course, they switch off, bringing in the next pair, causing a rotating motion. I'll switch on.
The vacuum cleaner motor doesn't at first sight look like Rex's tin can motor, but if you look inside you can see it has a lot of the same elements. This is the commutator, the rotating contacts. These are the coils of wire rotating around the shaft, and these are the coils of wire around the outside, making them both magnetic. Well, in fact, there are many different types of electric motor, but they all depend on the basic ability of electricity to produce magnetism. It's really quite difficult to imagine how inconvenient the world must have been without any electric motors. Most of the machines in the home depend on them. Vacuum cleaners, power tools, washing machines, fridges, tape recorders, and countless other gadgets. Steam engines, their predecessors, were hot and heavy and needed several hours stoking to get up pressure before they would work. Factories used to have a single steam engine connected to every machine in the place by a very elaborate set of belts and clutches. This was not very convenient or safe in a factory, and totally impractical in the home. The bit that actually does the sucking is the enclosed fan next to the motor. I can show you where the air goes if I hold some smoke over it. You can see that all the air is actually drawn straight through the middle of the motor to get to the fan. And the reason for this is that it helps to keep the motor cool. You can often feel the air coming out of the end of a vacuum cleaner is quite warm. And without this air passing through the motor, it would very quickly overheat. The fan itself works with these rotating vanes that whiz round and fling the air outwards. The air comes in the middle and the vanes go round, flinging the air outwards, and then there's a second set of vanes that doesn't rotate, a static set, and these channel the air back to the middle again. Then there's a second set of rotating vanes that fling the air outwards, and finally there's a second set of static vanes that channel the air back to the middle again. And having these two stages doubles the suction power. Well, one surprising thing about these fans is that they actually need less power to work when the inlet's blocked up. I can show you this with this meter which shows how much current the motor is using. And if I turn it on, you can actually hear the pitch of the motor rising when I block the inlet up, and that's because it's actually running faster. But of course it's also overheating because there's no air passing through it, so it's not really a very good idea. The power of the fan is quite surprising. Here we fixed the outlet of a vacuum cleaner to a plastic bag. The air pressure in the bag can quite comfortably lift my van off the ground. The vacuum cleaner actually has the power to inflate things on a much larger scale. This is a pig built for the Pink Floyd by a local firm. Once it's inflated, a miniature car vacuum cleaner is enough to compensate for the air lost through any holes and keep it full of air. And a full-size vacuum cleaner can keep enormous things inflated. The only time I've ever used a vacuum cleaner was for a machine that didn't need any of its impressive power. This is a collecting box I made for an ecological charity called Common Ground. It's a sort of pun on its name, showing a bit of ground being shared by different sorts of creature. The ground is actually a bit of rubber. I did my first experiments holding bits of rubber over a vacuum cleaner nozzle. Underneath, each footprint is connected to the suction pump at the bottom here by one of these hoses via a valve, each one by a separate valve, actually out of the washing machines. And this timer down the bottom here turns the valves on in sequence. The last important part of the vacuum cleaner is the dust bag, which acts as the filter. The paper or cloth contains minute holes which trap most of the dirt but let the air pass straight through. Of course, any bits of dirt that are smaller than the size of these holes, which are about 1/200th of a millimetre in diameter, will pass straight through the bag. I can show you this with this smoke cartridge that contains minute particles of red dye. If I put it next to the nozzle, you'll see the dye come straight through the machine and out through the grill here. Oh, I've got turned on. Normally about 15% of household dust is below this critical size and passes straight through the machine. The vacuum cleaner is really quite a simple machine. Just a motor, a fan and a dust bag. But it does have a particularly hard life, being pushed and tugged about all the time. Although they used to be sold with lifetime guarantees, today they rarely last more than a few years. The modern vacuum cleaner may not be perfect, but it is extraordinarily good value for money. In 1950, a vacuum cleaner cost about the same amount as the average weekly wage. Today, it costs a lot less than half that. An enormous amount of energy and cunning has gone into reducing the manufacturing costs, and perhaps for their price today, we can't really expect them to last for very long. Although vacuum cleaners are now rather flimsy and unsatisfying machines, and their short lifespan is ecologically very unsound, they do retain more character than most other household machines, and I can't help rather liking them. There's something rather magical about radio waves. They're actually a sort of invisible energy. This aerial can actually pick up enough of this energy to power this primitive receiver I made. It has no battery. It relies entirely on harnessing the energy of the radio waves in the air. It's not very loud, so I'll have to put it straight on the microphone so you can hear it. I managed to pick up Radio Israel broadcasting from Jerusalem on it one night. Although there's something quite wonderful about this little thing, radio sets have been around for so long now that they've become rather ordinary, unglamorous contraptions, and even the electronics inside now look rather familiar. In this program, I'm going to look at how these mysterious radio waves were discovered and how radio receivers managed to pick them up. Creating radio waves is actually very simple. Any electric spark emits them. Each of these sparks is sending out radio waves. You hear them on the radio as interference. That's why lightning makes radios crackle, and even the tiny spark inside a light switch is enough to produce a little pop. But without a radio set, though, it's not easy to detect these waves, and most scientists didn't believe they existed till just over 100 years ago. What finally convinced them was an experiment performed by the physicist Heinrich Hertz in 1887. It was first demonstrated in Britain by a scientist called Oliver Lodge here in the Royal Institution. Hertz used very big sparks created by a machine like this called an induction coil. You turn it on, Bill. This was connected to these metal plates with another spark gap in the middle, and this acted as a sort of aerial. This was Hertz's receiver. It's simply a loop of copper wire. Well, the big spark creates radio waves with enough energy to make a tiny spark jump across the gap between these balls in the receiver when they're held very close together. So, hold these in position. Okay, Bill. If you look carefully, you can just see the spark jumping across the gap. These sparks are so tiny that Hertz had to let his eyes get accustomed to the dark for 15 minutes and then watch the sparks through a magnifying glass. His apparatus only had a range of a few meters, and he had no interest in finding any practical uses for it. The first person to use radio waves for signalling was Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi had been a difficult child. His mother was a Jameson from the Irish whiskey distillers who had run away to Italy to be an opera singer and married an Italian landowner. She quickly got bored on his estate.
There's not much going on here. I think we'll go for a little jaunt.
The infant Marconi spent much of his childhood being dragged round Europe by his mother.
Where are we going, Mama?
Barcelona, or perhaps Boulogne.
Piatti colorati, la 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 la. Eccolo, eccolo lì, la 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 la.
He showed little interest at school and constantly irritated his father with ridiculous scientific experiments.
Cos'è? Eccoci. Eccola.
You broke my plate. I smashed your face.
Shortly after failing to get into university, he happened to read an article about Hertz's work.
Oh!
He immediately started obsessively experimenting and had soon managed to transmit the signals over a mile. Still aged only 20, he arrived in England to try and sell his ideas. Marconi had found that fixing one side of the spark gap to a long vertical wire made a much better aerial than Hertz's. This was further improved by connecting the other side of the spark gap to Earth. Apart from that, the transmitter was basically the same as Hertz's. Any electrical spark will do. Here it's being provided by the ignition circuit of Rex's pickup truck. This primitive transmitter has a surprisingly long range. Marconi also used a much more sensitive receiver called a coherer. This was based on a design by Oliver Lodge. This is my homemade version. It's just a tube of nickel filings. I made it by filing down a coin. You fix one end to the aerial, another kite, and the other end to the Earth. And what happens is that when it detects the radio waves, its electrical resistance falls dramatically, so it acts as a sort of switch and turns on a circuit. The theory behind it's very complicated and wasn't worked out till many years later, but it's quite simple to make it work. The only slightly complicated thing is that you have to have something to shake it to restore its high resistance at the end of each signal. So now if I signal to Rex, this is Marconi's original equipment that he brought to England with him. This is his transmitter with an induction coil like Hertz's and these balls that concentrated the energy of the spark. One end would have been connected to the aerial. This is his receiver. The aerial went on here. This is his coherer inside the glass tube. The filings are actually in the gap in the middle. And this is the device to tap it. Marconi would have been sending a combination of long pulses and short pulses, sending messages in Morse code. Well, this original apparatus only had a range of about 3 miles, but Marconi gradually increased the sensitivity of his coherers and the size of his transmitters till he was sending messages hundreds of miles. The larger transmitters had much larger spark gaps, which got very noisy, so he had to take to putting them in enclosed boxes. Marconi's early systems had a big disadvantage. They couldn't be tuned. You can hear the signal from our spark transmitter all across the short, medium and long wave bands. The reason is that sparks create chaotic waves of all sorts of different wavelengths. What was needed was a more precise transmitter than a spark. This was the solution, the tuned circuit. It suddenly all starts to look like a proper radio, but the basic parts are still quite simple. There's a coil of wire here called an inductor, and a series of overlapping metal plates here called a capacitor. The electricity whizzes backwards and forwards from one to the other, oscillating thousands of times a second. The valve acts as a sort of pump, keeping the whole thing going. You can see a picture of the radio waves this tuned circuit's transmitting on this oscilloscope that I've hooked up to a short aerial. If I hold it near the tuned circuit and switch on, you can see how regular the oscillations or waves that it's transmitting are. Now, if I compare this with the Spark machine, you can see just how chaotic its radio waves are. Once the tuned transmitter had been perfected, Spark transmitters were quickly banned for polluting the airwaves. With the problem of interference solved, radio seemed so miraculous that it could be capable of almost anything. Early radios did still have one limitation. They couldn't transmit speech, only the simple pulses of Morse code. Morse code still used for messages on the shortwave band, and pulse codes are also used for radio-controlled models.
I built this little car for a children's television series, and I've hooked up the oscilloscope to the transmitter so you can actually see the stream of pulses that the car receives. If I work this switch, that's the one that works the headlights, you can see it just moves one pulse. If I shift that one, it works two pulses, which actually opens the door. This one works the steering from left to right, you see it's moving four pulses. This one is shifting 5 pulses, and that's the speed control for forwards and backwards control, and so forth. Each series of pulses work a different function inside the car. To transmit speech and music instead of simple pulses, you first have to convert the sound to an electrical signal with a microphone, and then combine it with the radio waves. In the radio receiver, it all gets separated out again. You can see this very clearly on an oscilloscope. If I turn on this little radio, and I now plug the oscilloscope in to the loudspeaker, it's a bit large, this is giving a picture of the sound signal, and you can see it roughly matches the sound that's coming out of the loudspeaker. Now if I plug it in further back on the circuit, this is the sound signal combined with the radio waves. You can see the peaks still roughly match the sound that it's making, and the radio waves are actually going rapidly up and down in the middle. Now if I stretch this out a bit, these are the actual radio waves, and you can see what's happening is that the sound is constantly changing their size or their amplitude. And that's why this is called amplitude modulation, or AM radio. The man who designed much of the practical circuitry for AM radio was an American called Edwin Howard Armstrong. While in France during World War I, he invented the Superhet circuit, which has been used ever since. He then sold a patent to RCA back in America.
I have an appointment to see Mr. Sarnoff.
Oh, Mrs. Sarnoff's expecting you, Mr. Armstrong.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
He became a millionaire overnight and fell in love with the chairman's secretary.
How about you come for a spin in my motor?
Okay.
Hop in there.
Oh, it sure is a big one.
He bought a huge Hispano Suiza and climbed his tallest aerial to impress her. They were married soon afterwards.
Will you marry me? Oh, Howard, my hero.
The fundamental principles of radio have remained unchanged. This is the BBC transmitter at Brookman's Park, broadcasting medium wave radio to southeast England. Inside, the engineers have restored the BBC's very first transmitter, built by the Marconi Company in about 1920. This end of it actually creates the radio waves, and this end of it combines them with the sound signal, the amplitude modulation. It's basically a series of giant tuned circuits with the valves, the coils of wire of the inductors, and the overlapping metal plates of the capacitors. Well, this generates about 2 kilowatts. This may sound a lot, but this modern transmitter is rated 150 kilowatts, and it's all much more sophisticated. This one's actually broadcasting Radio 3 on AM all over southeast England. Inside, though, the basic components are still remarkably similar. The inductors have remained exactly the same, and the valves and capacitors, although they're now more enclosed, still work on the same principles as well. Transmitters like these broadcasting sound first appeared in World War I. They were used for sending messages by radio telephony. Broadcasting radio to entertain people was first started after the war by enthusiastic Marconi engineers. The BBC was then set up by the government in 1922, and listening to the radio rapidly became very popular. At first, most listeners had very simple receivers, crystal sets like the Rexophone. They needed enormous aerials because, like my radio at the start of the programme, they had no battery and relied entirely on the energy of the radio waves in the air.
Back on the literature they'd been taught in these academic institutions, they found it wasn't really their literature.
It's easier to see how they worked on this homemade version. Instead of a coherer, it has a lump of crystal and a fine wire called the cat's whisker. The electricity will only flow one way through the contact between the wire and the crystal, and this has the effect of separating out the sound from the radio waves. Like the coherer, the theory behind the cat's whisker is very complicated, but it's quite simple to make it work. The imperfect contact between teeth and fillings can occasionally have the same effect, causing a few unfortunate people to hear the radio inside their head all the time. This is the modern equivalent of the cat's whisker, the germanium diode. If I put it under a magnifying glass, you can see it's an enclosed version of the same thing. You can see the whisker just touching the lump of germanium. And the primitive radio I had at the beginning of the programme worked with one of these, and in fact most modern transistor radios still use them as well. Much of the radio set's evolution has been preserved by Gerald Wells at the Vintage Wireless Museum. If you wanted something better than a crystal set, what sort of thing would you have had?
Well, you could have had something like this, which is 3 separate units, hence it was called a wireless or radio set, because it was a set of parts. It would have consisted of a tuned circuit, an RF amplifier, a detector stage, and a power output stage. And that would have got you most of the local stations with earphones or a modest loudspeaker.
What happened after that was the next stage?
Well, the next stage, they decided to stick it all in one box to make it less wires and to make it neater. And this was a bit more elaborate as well. More stations were coming onto the airwaves, so more elaborate tuning was needed. So they brought in series parallel switching for your aerials and tuned circuits, variable condenser and reaction condenser, an RF stage to amplify the signal, detector stage to take the place of the old-fashioned cat's whisker, and 2 stages of LF amplification. That would be quite an elaborate set, but you could, by moving these bars around, do away with those stages and listen with earphones on there and save a lot of battery power.
Oh, I see. When did they start enclosing all the working parts of the radios?
Well, certainly by the mid-20s, when they decided that this wasn't really very nice in the living. And so they started building it into familiar objects, like the medicine chest, for instance, where it could be easily disguised, and that wouldn't disgrace any respectable home.
What other shapes?
Well, the most famous of all, of course, is the smoker's cabinet. Every home had a smoker's cabinet. You'd have a your pipe racks and the bits at the top. Smoking was big industry. You'd have your drawer at the bottom where you'd have your pipe cleaners, your matches and your tobacco, and it would all fold away and look quite innocent. It didn't scream wireless at you.
Of course, all these early radios were powered by batteries, weren't they?
Well, yes, sir. There was very little electricity around. And the early radios required a 2-volt accumulator, sometimes 4 or 6, but usually 2, which had to be charged up every week. So that meant you had 2 of them, one being charged, one in use. And you'd need a high-tension battery. You'd need a grid bias battery. The grid bias battery lasted about a year and cost 9p. That would last about 3 months and cost you 7 and 6p.
So it was all quite expensive then?
It was an expensive business, and it took a lot of rigging up. You had to have an elaborate aerial nerve system, and all the bother of getting your accumulator charged every week. Admitted it was only fruitless and reasonably cheap, but it did mean you had to be careful. You had about 20 hours listening a week. So but when you went to your radio shop, there was usually a Radio Times provided on the counter. That saved you buying one. And with the aid of their Bakelite fountain pen and a pad, you could make notes of what was worth listening to during the following week. So you could pick your programs and plan your meals around the wireless set. You didn't just hear it, you actually sat down and listened to it and gave it all your attention. You had to, it cost you so much to rig up. And of course, when you came in with your accumulator every week, there was all the other old tabbers and rat bags in there changing the accumulators as well, and you would discuss the programs. So the reputation of wireless programs was made and lost in a wireless shop.
By the 30s, the appearance of radios had started to change dramatically with the introduction of the new material Bakelite. Pioneered in Britain by the Echo Company, this could be moulded to almost any shape. Its one drawback was that it was easily breakable. The biggest change in broadcast radio since the war has been the introduction of FM. The great advantage is that it's much less susceptible to interference. The spark, which drowns out AM radio, is hardly audible on FM.
Mrs. Thatcher, why should use the phrase guerrilla warfare? Because there are...
FM stands for frequency modulation. The principle behind it is really quite simple. Instead of the sound altering the amplitude of the radio waves, as in AM, it alters their frequency. FM radio was yet another invention of Howard Armstrong. He started work in the early 30s with a missionary zeal to produce true hi-fi radio. After encouraging tests with RCA, the company suddenly pulled out.
Sarnoff! Well, why have you cancelled my project?
Get off my back.
Hi-fi radio is the thing of the future.
When FM radio was becoming established, Armstrong and RCA started a lengthy battle over the patents.
You have stolen my ideas. You did not. I was the inventor. Certainly not.
This had a disastrous effect on his health and on his marriage.
Ah, that's such a terrible day.
By the way, I'm leaving.
This is the last straw. I can't take any more.
Domestic radios have also become much more sophisticated. Many now have automatic push-button tuning, and the sound quality can be very impressive, particularly in stereo FM. But despite this improvement, radio has really been eclipsed by television and other modern marvels, and radio sets aren't the important prized possessions they once were. In fact, the whole idea of a separate radio set is rather disappearing. Radios now tend to be combined with cassette tape recorders or alarm clocks or hi-fi systems. Radio is so taken for granted today, it's hard to think of it as magical anymore. But I hope in this programme I've managed to persuade you that it still is. Something bizarre like this set, which Rex and I were working on last year, is obviously an illusion. But in fact, me and almost everything else on television is really just as much of an illusion. While you're sitting at home watching this programme, I'll probably be sitting at home watching it too. What you're actually looking at is an elaborate illusion created by a reel of videotape. The video recorder, like the other machines in this series, has become quite indispensable, yet very few people have any idea how the thing works. In this programme, Rex and I are going to try and demystify it a bit. Inside, it does look quite baffling. One half is full of a mass of electronics and circuit boards, and the other half, where the cassette goes in, is full of equally baffling mechanisms, gears and pulleys and things. But despite all this complexity, the basic principles of magnetic recording are really very simple. They were first developed nearly 100 years ago for recording sound. A Danish telephone engineer called Valdemar Poulsen, convinced that there was a need for a permanent record of business transactions conducted by telephone, started experimenting with magnetic recording in 1896. Poulsen had found he could magnetize a bit of steel and then see exactly where he'd magnetized it by dipping it in some iron filings. He could magnetize the steel in just the same way with an electromagnet. This is just a coil of wire wrapped around a lump of steel. But he could also use the electromagnet, like the iron filings, to see where he'd magnetized it. I've connected this electromagnet to a meter here, and if I bring a permanent magnet anywhere near it, I think you can see the meter move. It's actually creating some electricity. So if I now pass the electromagnet along the strip of steel, you can see it moves at the point where I magnetized it earlier. This may seem surprising, but the properties of electricity and magnetism are intimately connected. Well, now I can use the endless loop of steel of my bandsaw to make the bandsaw into a primitive tape recorder. First I've got to connect the whole thing up to a battery and a switch. Well, now I can magnetize a few places on the steel strip, or in other words, record a few magnetic pulses. And now I can see where I've magnetized it on the strip simply by continuing to run. In other words, I'm playing the signal back. This is the basic principle of magnetic recording, and it's just the same on the most sophisticated modern video recorder. The heart of the machine is this spinning drum. Underneath, if I undo this screw, this is the actual tape head, and you can see it's a tiny coil of wire. It's an electromagnet, and it's doing exactly the same thing as the electromagnet on the bandsaw. Well, without all this sophistication, Poulsen had enormous difficulty recording the tiny electrical signals he was picking up from the telephone. However, he applied for patents all over the world and found eager backers in America.
Hello? No, don't worry about the science. My invention is foolproof. All you need to know is you'll make lots of money.
What do you think, Marvin?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, it's a deal.
Thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is your chance now to buy and make the fortune of a lifetime. Yes, I'm talking about money.
The backers were more interested in trading the stocks and shares than making telegraphones. But 7 years later, a saleable machine finally did appear, advertised as a dictation system.
We have no option except to foreclose on this. Your sincerely, Hiram T. Washbucket.
I'll type this up right away. Oh, I can't hear a thing. It's impossible. impossible. No, I can't.
Oh, I'll go back to doing things the old way.
Okay, suits
Thursday,
me.
25th January.
This is one of the Science Museum's wonderful stores, and this is one of the few surviving telegraphones. In a way, it's quite like a modern tape recorder with its two reels and the tape head in the middle. This contains the tiny electromagnets and actually records on this fine steel wire. The trouble was, though, that the sound it reproduced was really just too faint to be of any practical use at all. Rex and I had a go at making a working model of one of these, and we couldn't hear anything through it at all. But the idea wasn't totally forgotten, and as valves and electronic amplifiers improved, the idea became progressively more practical. Also, a German Dr. Stieler spent most of the 1920s methodically analysing the theoretical principles of magnetic recording, and eventually, in conjunction with Marconi, started producing massive machines like this. This particular machine was bought by the BBC in 1933. The tape heads are up at the top here, and it uses this very fine, razor-sharp steel tape. It's all incredibly large because to get a good enough sound quality, it has to run very, very fast, so it uses up a lot of tape. This high speed has some disadvantages. You had to keep the tape oiled. There's a little oiler over here. And it was also quite dangerous. You had to keep well out of the way because if the tape broke, this razor-sharp steel would fly all over the room. Recording on steel still has one specialist use, where heat resistance is important, in black box flight recorders. The boxes are actually orange, not black, and they're extremely strong and well insulated. Inside, you can see the bright stainless steel wire being replayed. The recorder is connected to a computer, and it prints out the positions of the rudder, elevators and other controls. On a modern jumbo jet, over 60 items are recorded. Experiments with plastic tape were started by the German Magnetophone company in the 1930s. The tape's coated with a magnetic powder that actually records the signal. This powder is a sort of iron oxide or rust, which is why the tape's always brown. Well, we can make a primitive sort of recording tape using sticky tape and sprinkling some rust powder on it. A little bit more. I just have to rub it into the sticky side. Take off all the excess. Right. Right. Now we've recorded some we put it in an ordinary audio recorder. Yeah, I think I've got it in the right place.
Ready?
Okay. Yep.
This is recorded on sticky tape and rust. This is recorded on sticky tape and rust.
Right. And now what we have to do is to play it back again. The right way round. Put it in. Right. Okay.
This is recorded on sticky tape.
Well, the start of it was very